What's a commonly taught historical fact that just isn't true? Most of the well-known medieval torture devices never really existed. There's no mention of the Iron Maiden in history texts prior to the late 18th century, and all known examples of the device are forgeries or replicas created around the same time. Similarly, there are no authentic examples of the Pear of Anguish, nor is the device attested to in any medieval records. The various examples that are on display in various dubious museums are almost certainly of much more recent construction and would not function as described anyway. It is common to think that they must be medieval torture devices because we tend to associate medieval times as some sort of ultra-brutalistic Dark Ages, but most of these torture devices were designed and used during the Renaissance through the 18th century. Regardless of the device used, you certainly would not want to find yourself in that situation, in that time frame. It's more that they were created as spectacles and examples of historical torture devices to be displayed as such, but were nothing more than imaginative props created to entertain while on display as torture devices. Most were never used to torture anyone. Whoever came up with them said they were because that helped to sell the story that they were, and thus made them interesting things, like a jackalope or a unicorn.
The Gutenberg Bible is not the first book printed using metal movable type. The first book printed using movable metal type is Jikji from Korea. It was printed during the Goryeo dynasty and published in Heungdeok Temple in 1377, which is 78 years prior to Johannes Gutenberg's acclaimed 42-line Bible printed during the years 1452-1455. UNESCO confirmed Jikji as the world's oldest metalloid type in September 2001 and includes it in the Memory of the World program. Early printing presses were more impactful in Europe due to alphabet differences. My understanding is that the far more numerous character counts used in most Asian languages minimize the usefulness of the movable type, while giving European languages with far fewer letter choices a distinct practical advantage.
This made a difference in the early history of the PC too, explaining why the PC industry took off in Silicon Valley despite Japan being the leader in electronics at the time. The Western alphabet could be stored fairly efficiently, ASCII, because there are only 26 letters, and all the letters can be distinctly represented with just 8A8 pixels. They were easier to input too. So while the West evolved towards general-purpose computing and was able to bring to market relatively affordable PCs starting in the 1970s, that just wasn't viable in Japan until much later.
Columbus had trouble getting funding for his voyages because everyone thought the world was flat and he'd sail off the edge. Most everyone knew the world was round and had a pretty good idea of its size. They thought he'd run out of food and water before he could reach the Indies because of the vast distance. He thought the world was much smaller than it is and could sail there in time. IOW, he was very wrong, but lucky.
Medieval people were dirty and had patchy clothes. They had big tubs around to wash their hands and faces often, and they would bathe weekly at least in a lake or river. Some peasants were so good at sewing that it is almost as good as modern machine sewing. Also that they only lived to middle age. If there wasn't a war or plague going on, then you'd live to 60-80. The death age is low because so many babies died during pregnancy and childbirth that when you average the age that common died at, it brings the stat down to middle age. If you lived past childhood and there wasn't a war or dangerous disease going around, then you'd live almost as long as we do now.
Native Americans were peaceful and got along before European settlers showed up.
This is a myth that just won't die. The pre-industrial world was brutal across the globe as different tribes groups fought for limited resources. The related myth is that indigenous North Americans were all the same. There are hundreds of nations with unique cultures and histories. Some mostly hunted, some had mixed farming and hunting, and others fished. Some were more warlike, while others were generally peaceful. There is a rich and complex history among North American tribes.
Almost every group of humans have done something horrendous to another one. I just remember being taught this in elementary school. And so many people still believe it today that everything was happy imp. Rainbows before the Europeans showed up. Imp. It's a total lie. I'm not justifying what settlers did, just focusing on the piece where tribes also were cruel to each other in ways we can't imagine.